There is a journal entry in the State Library of New South Wales, digitized and freely readable through Project Gutenberg Australia. It is page 83 of Thomas Mitchell's Journal of an Expedition into the Interior of Tropical Australia, published in 1848. It shows a field of native grain along the Narran River, harvested and pulled and stacked into dry heaps, standing tall enough to reach the saddle girth of a man's horse, running for 9 continuous miles. Mitchell wrote it on the 15th of April, 1846. He was the Surveyor-General of New South Wales. He was not looking for evidence of agriculture. He was mapping land. The thing in the entry that does not match what the official record says should be there is simple. The land Mitchell was riding through was, in the legal language that would soon be applied to it, waste. Unoccupied. Unimproved. What his own horse was standing in was 9 miles of harvested cereal crop. I looked at it for a long time. Then I went looking for what it showed. What this journal entry shows is not a curiosity. It shows a working agricultural system, native millet, Panicum lavanode, cultivated, harvested and processed by indigenous communities along a river system in inland New South Wales. That world existed. The record confirms it existed, in Mitchell's own hand, on a specific page, on a specific date. What the record does not confirm is why, within a single lifetime, it stopped appearing in any official account of that land at all. Here is what the record tells us about the world this journal entry shows. Mitchell's field notes describe the grain reaching the height of his saddle girths, the stalks packed densely enough that he rode through them for 9 miles without a break in the crop. He recorded indigenous women gathering and stacking the harvest into heaps to prepare flour. He noted, in the same entry, that this system produced a more dependable food supply than the dryland farming techniques Europeans were using at the time. This was not an isolated patch. It was a managed system tied to the seasonal behavior of the river, requiring the kind of sustained, generational knowledge that lets a community harvest the same fields, in the same way, for long enough that no one needs to explain how it works. The detail that matters most is this. Nothing about the scale of what Mitchell described required him to reconsider the categories he was using to map it. He wrote it down as a field observation. He did not write it down as agricultural infrastructure, because the surveying vocabulary he was working within that year had no such category for land that was not fenced, not titled, and not European in form. Mitchell was not a naturalist looking for evidence of agriculture to support an argument. He was a surveyor filling in a route map, and the grain fields were simply what stood between one campsite and the next. He measured them the way he measured everything else on the expedition, by comparison to familiar reference points, in this case the height of his own horse. That habit of comparison is itself part of the record. It tells us the crop was dense and tall enough that a trained military surveyor reached for a physical yardstick rather than a rough estimate, and it tells us he expected his readers back in Sydney to need that comparison to believe what he was describing. To the people harvesting along the Narran River in April of 1846, none of this was remarkable. It was the ordinary texture of a food system that had been there long enough that no one needed to explain it to anyone. Here is where the record goes quiet. 4 months after Mitchell's entry, on the 28th of August, 1846, the British Parliament passed the Wastelands Australia Act 9 and 10 Victoria, Chapter 104. It was implemented in New South Wales through an order in council dated the 9th of March, 1847, proclaimed in the colony that September. Chapter 1 of that order divided the colony into 3 categories: settled, intermediate, and unsettled districts. The exact territory Mitchell had surveyed, the Narran, the Barwon, the Lower Maranoa, fell into the unsettled category. Chapter 2 authorized pastoral leases of up to 14 years across that category, restricted by law to the grazing of sheep and cattle. Cultivation was permitted only for the immediate food needs of the leaseholder's own staff. Before March 1847, the record, Mitchell's record, describes 9 miles of harvested native grain. After March 1847, the same land is described in an order in council as unsettled district, available for pastoral lease. The transition is documented. The act exists. The order exists. What is not documented is the transition itself, No clause considers the grain fields. No debate weighs what would happen to a food system built on soft, cultivated riverbank soil once 14-year grazing leases put hard-hooved cattle across it. Mitchell himself predicted the outcome in his own journal. The Act does not mention it at all. This is not the silence of a fire, or a flood, or a war. Those events leave a different kind of record damage assessments, emergency accounts, a tally of what was lost. This silence produced nothing like that. The grain fields were present in the documentary record. Then, the record changed categories, and they were not present in it again. The journal entry in the State Library of New South Wales is dated the 15th of April, 1846. It shows 9 miles of harvested native grain. There is no subsequent survey in the years immediately following that returns to describe the same fields in the same terms. The record does not say whether this is because no one went back to look or because what they found no longer matched the description on file. I looked for the same kind of record somewhere else, and I found it. In the Amazon basin, between 1783 and 1792, the Portuguese naturalist Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira documented enriched anthropogenic soils he called terra de jardins, garden earth supporting managed orchards along the Rio Negro. His manuscripts and drawings, now catalogued at the Biblioteca Nacional do Rio de Janeiro as Codis 21:1-15, were extensive. Agricultural description, soil description, botanical illustration. When Ferreira returned to Lisbon, the Portuguese crown, acting through its overseas ministry, classified the material as a state secret to keep rival powers from mapping Amazonian resources. It was sequestered inside the Real Gabinete de Historia Natural da Ajuda, withheld from publication or scientific review. 11,000 kilometers from the Narran River. The same silence in a different archive. In 1808, during the French invasion of Portugal, the naturalist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire was sent to Lisbon under orders from General Junot to inspect the Ajuda collection. He confiscated major portions of Ferreira's material and shipped it to Paris, where it was absorbed into the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle under a transfer inventory dated the 13th of August, 1808. The manuscript record was now split across Lisbon, Paris, and Rio de Janeiro before Brazil had even drawn up its own land law. When Brazil finally did the Lei de Terras of the 18th of September 1850 and its regulatory decree of January 30, 1854, the law required proof of occupation demonstrated through European-style cultivation to establish land title. Anthropogenic soil enrichment and managed agroforestry did not qualify. Land that did not meet that standard was declared terras devolutas, vacant public land. Ferreira's Terra de Jardins is not named anywhere in either statute. The documentation existed. The soil existed. The 1850 law simply had no category that could hold it. In Java, in 1845, the naturalist Franz Wilhelm Junghun documented mountain forests protected under customary law as Angkor and Keramat sacred, off-limits to logging and unauthorized clearing, enforced by village authority for generations. In 1865, the Dutch colonial government issued the Boschreglement Staatsblad 1865 No. 96, placing all Javanese teak and wildwood forest under a new state forest service, with no exemption written in for sacred designations. 5 years later, the Agrarische Wet of 1870 and its executive decree, the Agrarische Besluit, went further. Article 1 of the Besluit stated the principle directly: all land to which ownership cannot be proven belongs to the state. Land held communally under unwritten customary authority could not produce that proof. The sacred forests Junghun had mapped became, by that single article, ordinary state domain. Later forestry regulation in Java reinforced the same override. In 1874, a revised Boschreglement Staatsblad 1874 No. 110 expanded state extraction fees and permits across wildwood forest. with no clause added anywhere to acknowledge the sacred designations. The 1,865 and 1,870 instruments had already voided. Each successive law simply built on the previous one's silence, rather than correcting it. The world Mitchell's journal shows did not disappear in one place. It stopped appearing in the official record in 3 locations, across 3 empires, writing in 3 languages, within roughly 25 years of each other. The silences are not identical. One is a pastoral lease, one is a land title statute, one is a forestry ordinance, but they have the same shape. That shape is not the shape of gradual change. Gradual change leaves arguments for and against, partial adoptions, holdouts, correspondence about what to do with the difficult cases. This shape is different. In each case, a specific dated law was passed, and the world that existed just before it simply stopped being a category the law could describe. Here is the question I kept returning to. Not why did these food systems disappear? How does something stop being visible without anyone deciding to make it invisible? A world becomes invisible to a record when the record's categories no longer contain it. Not through fire, not through decision, through the administrative act of updating the vocabulary. When the form changes, what the old form recorded stops being recordable, not destroyed, unclassifiable. And the unclassifiable gets processed toward the nearest available label: pastoral lease, vacant land, state domain, which is never quite right, and which over time becomes the only description anyone remembers. The Narran River grain fields had a name in Mitchell's vocabulary in April of 1846. Cultivated ground, harvested crop, native industry. That name had no equivalent in the Wastelands Act's vocabulary 11 months later. Once the name was gone, the land could not be officially recorded as what it was. It could be recorded as unsettled district, available for lease, but not as what Mitchell had actually ridden through, and what cannot be named in the record cannot be protected by the record. What cannot be protected becomes available in this case to 14-year pastoral tenants and their cattle. The same thing happened to Ferreira's soil descriptions under the Ley de Terras and to Jung-hoon's sacred forests under the Domin Verklaring. 3 surveyors, 3 empires, 1 mechanism. The Narran River fields did not need an enemy. They needed a vocabulary that had no word for them. That vocabulary arrived in New South Wales in March of 1847. After that, Mitchell's journal is the only record that the word was ever necessary. If this is the kind of history that doesn't get taught with dates attached, subscribing helps more of it reach people who'd want to see the paperwork. Thomas Mitchell is on the Narran River, the 15th of April, 1846. He dismounts from his horse and reaches down to measure the grain heads against his own saddle girth. He is the Surveyor-General of New South Wales, leading an expedition of 23 men and bullock teams. His job is to produce an accurate map of the interior for the Crown. The record shows what he did next. He wrote down what he saw, the height of the grain, the stacking, the scale of it, 9 miles worth. He wrote that it produced more reliable food than European dryland farming. And in the same entry, he wrote that his own maps would guide European livestock onto this exact ground. He was not making a decision about the future of indigenous agriculture. He was doing his job, recording terrain, producing the survey the colony needed to open the land. In doing exactly that, accurately and honestly, he became the mechanism. 1 surveyor with 1 notebook on 1 afternoon. The order in council that reclassified this land as unsettled district came 11 months after Mitchell's entry. Mitchell did not write that order. The record does not show that anyone consulted his description of the grain fields when it was drafted. What happened to the Narran River fields is not a mystery solved at the top. It is a process completed in a survey notebook and finished months later in an executive order that never mentions the notebook at all. I want to be honest about what this record cannot show me, not as a disclaimer, as the most precise thing I can say about what this looked for. I cannot show you whether the Wastelands Act's silence on indigenous cultivation was deliberate or simply the product of a legal system that had never needed the category before. I cannot show you whether the officials who drafted the 1,847 order in council had read Mitchell's journal or knew what it described. And I cannot show you whether what happened along the Narran River, the Rio Negro, and the Javanese highlands is one connected pattern of colonial administration or three separate systems arriving at the same design, because vacant land doctrine solves the same problem the same way wherever it is applied. What the journal entry shows is real. What the statutes show around it are real. The shape of the silence present in the record, then reclassified, with no accounting in between, is real in all three cases. What I cannot show you is intent behind that shape. A shape without documented intent is not proof of a plan. It is a description of what the record contains and what it does not. I spent a long time with Mitchell's entry before I went looking for the pattern around it. A mind that spends that long with one page starts finding its shape everywhere. I am not exempt from that. What I am asking is whether the record actually requires the pattern I've described, or whether something simpler accounts for all of it, three legal systems, independently, needing a way to call unfenced land empty. I have not found the simpler explanation. That is not my conclusion. That is where this stopped. There is one thing that connects the world in Mitchell's journal to right now. Panicum lavanode, the native millet he measured against his horse, is not extinct. It still grows wild across inland New South Wales, Queensland, the Northern Territory, South Australia, and Western Australia, listed as least concern under national and most state conservation frameworks. A lectotype specimen from Mitchell's own expedition sits in the Cambridge University Herbarium. Living voucher specimens are held today at the National Herbarium of New South Wales and the Australian National Herbarium. It survived not because the 1,847 order protected it, but because a grass growing wild on unfenced land had no category the pastoral lease system needed to eliminate on purpose. The cultivation around it was reclassified out of existence. The plant itself was simply never named in the statute at all. The journal is still in the State Library of New South Wales, still readable in the same 1848 edition, page 83. It still describes 9 miles of grain reaching a horse's saddle girth. Nothing about the page has changed. What has changed is what it contains now that you know an act existed 11 months later with no word in it for what the page describes. That world was not destroyed. It was processed through a vocabulary that had no designation for cultivated, unfenced, communally worked land, no instrument for measuring it, and no category for what it would have cost to keep recording it as what it was. The millet remains, and if you look at it long enough, it tells you exactly how a world stops being visible, not through fire, not through decision, through the completely ordinary act of a law that never got around to writing the word that would have kept it on the record. The next time you walk past a stretch of open, unfenced grassland, the kind a survey might once have called waste, or vacant, or unimproved, you will be looking at the kind of ground the journal describes. It will look the way it always looked. The records that describe it now will use the vocabulary that replaced the one Mitchell was using in April of 1846. You will not be able to tell the difference from the outside. That is the one thing the journal cannot show you. What it felt like to stand in that field before the vocabulary changed.